So Professor Michael Davis works at Oklahoma State University in exercise physiology. But initially, Mike graduated from Texas Uni in 1984, and then he did a master's in equine internal medicine at Virginia Tech. He followed that by a PhD on respiratory physiology at Johns Hopkins University. He then went on to obtain 2 boards, the American College of Veterinary Internal Medicine and the American College of Veterinary Sports Medicine and Rehabilitation. Throughout his career, which is certainly not over, it's still ongoing, Mike has been working actively in the area of sports physiology, and both in the equine and the canine species. His work has been groundbreaking in many aspects, and he was awarded some numerous prizes for the excellence of his work. He has over 100 publications, including book chapters. He is a very regular speaker at international conferences, and it's really my great pleasure to be with Mike tonight to talk about how do equine athletes create energy?
Yeah, so thank you, Emmanuel, for this presentation. I think it was quite interesting if you didn't know Michael. So before we start, I just wanted to introduce Arioneo very quickly, because I'm not sure that everyone is familiar with the company. So Arioneo is a company who was created in 2014, and we're dedicated to design technology that monitors both performance and health parameters. So we have 2 brands. We have the training solutions with Equimeter. So Equimeter is a racehorse technology, which records cardio, GPS, and locomotion data during your racehorse training. So it's mostly designed for racehorse trainer and owners. And then we have the vet services, which is new from last year. And so we have the first product, Equimeter Vet. So this product also records the cardio, GPS, and locomotion data, but it also records the EKG, which is scientifically validated. And then we have HSIM, which quantifies the locomotion of your horses and helps to diagnose locomotor asymmetries. So that's it for Arioneo, and I'm gonna let the floor to Michael.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle, and thank you, Emmanuel, for your introduction. Very quickly, this presentation is set up to, timing-wise, to be able to answer questions. What we felt we should do is, if you have questions and you throughout the presentation and you're not sure that you'll be able to remember them, enter them in the chat function. And at the end of the presentation, we'll go through the chat, answer questions, and then if time allows, and if there are still more questions, then we'll see if we can't activate a few microphones and let folks ask questions live. So we'll start by sort of pointing out that horses as a species evolved or became established about 40 million years ago, if you believe the archaeologists. But since 40 million years ago, there's been quite a bit of evolution from an animal that was about the size of a small dog to what we have in our stables today. From a scientific standpoint, the horse is defined by a thoroughbred mare named Twilight. She was the source of the Equine Genome Project. And so when you go looking for genes, the reference genome is this one single mare, which really does kind of oversimplify what we see practically. Horses are capable of doing a lot of different things, and in order to understand the exercise, you have to first understand the different exercise disciplines and how they go about doing that, how it's limited, That's going to be the subject of this webinar, as well as 2 more webinars that are scheduled for January and February on how an equine athlete works, how you make them work better, and how you try to figure out what's wrong when they're not working the way you'd like them to. Everybody has gained some familiarity with the sort of defining performance for different disciplines in equine athletics. But a lot of times you're not quite as well informed as you might think. For example, we have an entire breed, the American quarter horse, that was developed specifically for sprinting, but yet a thoroughbred holds the world record currently for the fastest quarter mile, not an American quarter horse. Everybody has probably seen pictures or videos, or maybe you were around long enough ago to see it live. Secretariat's iconic 31 length victory in the Belmont Stakes in 1973. But Secretariat doesn't hold the record for a mile and a half. Hawkster ran it a couple of seconds faster than Secretariat in 1989. So we all would like to be able to have our horses achieve these kinds of performances, but we first have to understand how they do it in the first place. Let's start with sprinting. A sprint is all about acceleration, and acceleration scientifically is defined as force divided by mass, which means as much force as you can generate with as little mass as possible. The force is being generated by muscle mass, so you're going to have that amount of muscle mass, and the more you have it, the faster you'll be able to accelerate. All other mass, including the rider, is bad. And so you try to minimize that as much as possible. Most sprint events are multiple accelerations, but each acceleration is simply force divided by mass. If we go on a little bit longer, if we get out beyond acceleration, then we're talking about aerobic exercise. And for aerobic exercise, cardiopulmonary capacity is the key, because aerobic exercise is going to be defined by how quickly can you get oxygen to the working muscle. It's also to some degree going to be defined by how quickly can you remove heat from the working muscle. So when we're training for aerobic, we're training for cardiovascular capacity. Mass is still important. If you go back through the history, you can see the effects of handicapping. Farlap was one of the greatest aerobic athletes that we have in the thoroughbred record. 32 out of 35 races in the early 1930s. They did eventually slow Farlap down, finished 8th in the 1931 Melbourne Cup, carrying over 50 pounds more than the winner. You can put enough weight on a horse, it will slow down. If we go to the next step, endurance exercise, endurance exercise is submaximal. So, aerobic capacity is not going to be directly relevant. If a horse has got an aerobic capacity of 140 milliliters per kilogram per minute of oxygen consumption, but they're only exercising at about 100, then obviously that extra 40 may not be all that important. But the things that define aerobic capacity are still going to be important for endurance capacity, because it's all about blood flow. This time, it's not just about delivering oxygen, it's also delivering the fuel that's going to be burned with that oxygen. And that blood flow to the muscle is also removing the wastes of those metabolic processes, the lactic acid, the heat, the CO2. So we're still going to be focused on cardiovascular capacity for an endurance horse. If we're talking about just sheer power, draft horses and weight pulling, the number of muscle fibers and how effectively they can be activated is going to define how well a draft horse can pull a load. The difference between a good draft horse and a great draft horse, though, is not just the number of muscle fibers, it's technique and how effectively can they bring those muscle fibers to bear to pull the load? So we swing the pendulum all the way to the other end of the spectrum, seemingly, going from draft pulling to dressage. A lot of people will look at a dressage horse and say, you know, they're not exercising that hard, so exercise physiology is probably not that important for a dressage horse. They would be wrong, because dressage requires a finely tuned athlete, one that can effectively generate muscle energy in order to perform this discipline. Top riders, top trainers know this. They know not to just blow off a conditioning program for a top dressage horse. No matter what kind of exercise you're talking about, physiologically, we're worried about three primary systems. We're worried about the respiratory system. We're worried about the cardiovascular system. We're worried about the muscle system. The job of the respiratory system is to obtain oxygen from the environment. The oxygen's free. It's in the air that we breathe, but the cost of obtaining that oxygen is very, very high. The job of the cardiovascular system is to take that oxygen and all the other elements of metabolism, transport them around the body, ultimately get them to the muscle to be burned, but then also remove the waste products. And ultimately, the job of the muscle is to take chemical energy in the form of oxygen and some sort of carbon chain and convert it to mechanical energy, a muscle contraction. The idea is to be able to do this as quickly as you can, as long as you can, in order to beat all the rest of the horses to the finish line. So let's start by talking about how muscle contracts, a very simple example of how muscle will contract. No matter what kind of muscle you're talking about a tissue that releases calcium from stored reserves inside the cell in order to activate muscle contraction. The contractile fibers have already been primed to do so. It's just an electrical, and when the nerve stimulates the muscle, calcium gets released. Once the calcium gets released, it unlocks those contractile fibers that have been primed by adenosine triphosphate, the energy molecule in the muscle, in order to then contract. Once you've contracted, great. You've contracted the muscle, but exercise is not a single muscle contraction. Exercise is sequential contraction and relaxation. In order for that muscle to contract a second time, it has to first relax. And in order to relax, the first step is stop releasing the calcium. The second step is to pump that calcium back out of the cell into its storage sites. This is a very, very energetically intensive process because that calcium is being pumped up a 10,000-fold gradient in order to clear it from the muscle cell. Only after you've removed that calcium from the muscle cell does the myosin detach from the actin and allow the muscle to relax. For every exercise, for every propulsive contraction, skeletal muscle must be paired with relaxation. You have to both contract it, but then you have to relax it in order to be able to contract it again. This is going to come into play very, very clearly as we describe how a horse fatigues. So we're talking about ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Where does the ATP come from? That's the energy currency of the cell. The easiest, the quickest, the most direct way of making ATP is to have it on hand already. So the muscle cell will store a little bit of ATP. It will also store a little bit of creatine phosphate, which can be used to form ATP in a single reaction very, very quickly. Boom, you've got ATP. The drawback to this is that overall, it's not very much. For those of you that work with horses, this is the energy form that allows the horse to kick you once, maybe twice, but it's only good for a couple of seconds. And so after it's kicked you twice, this energy form is exhausted and it can't be used to power contraction anymore. The next quickest way is anaerobic metabolism, taking a glucose molecule and turning it into 2 lactic acid molecules. By doing that, you get 4 ATPs. You can get 4 ATPs very, very quickly because there aren't that many reactions in order to go from glucose to lactate, and you get all that ATP. You can do that for, maybe 30 seconds to a minute before you run out of this pathway. And in order to keep using it, you do have to figure out what to do with that lactic acid. You can't just leave it there. Aerobic metabolism is the 3rd way of making ATP. It is the most efficient way of making ATP. You take oxygen and any old carbon chain, it typically glucose, but it can also be fatty acids, it can be amino acids, and you convert it to CO2, you convert it to water and heat, and you convert it to a lot of ATP. This is by far the most efficient way of making ATP. Unfortunately, it's also the slowest way of making ATP. A horse can only exercise as fast as it can produce ATP. So while this is a very, very efficient way of doing so, it's not fast enough to fuel exclusively anything but maybe a trot to a slow canter. Anything faster than that, and you're just going to need a faster way of producing ATP in order to turn around and burn it faster. If we put all of those things together, it's a nice orderly transition. It's something that you can very, very easily predict. The first handful of seconds of strenuous exercise is fueled by the preformed ATP and a little bit of phosphocreatine. It's not going to get you very far. You've only got a couple of seconds, and honestly, there aren't very many athletic events that only last for a couple of seconds. So you're going to need more than that, but it will get you at least out of the gate. You turn to anaerobic production of ATP for the next 20 to 30 seconds, up to maybe a total of 2 minutes. For the most part, it peaks at about a minute. There are some, obviously, some events that only last that long. Most rodeo events, a lot of sprinting events, a quarter mile, you can cover in less than a minute. And so this will work very, very nicely. It's always going on with a little bit of aerobic metabolism in the background, but it will get you out for about a minute before it starts to taper off. After about a minute, you'd better have aerobic metabolism kicking in, because that's going to be the source of the majority of the ATP that'll get you beyond a minute, beyond a sprint, into aerobic exercise, into anything that lasts more than a minute or two. So we've talked about how to make ATP, but we can't forget about the wastes. If you don't get rid of the wastes, the accumulation of waste products will cause this whole system to shut down, just as if you plugged up the exhaust on your car. You have to be able to get rid of the waste. And in this particular case, the most important waste that we're going to talk about, and we'll talk about it over and over again, is going to be the heat and the lactic acid. So we've got all of these processes that we can bring to bear. Let's talk about metabolism from a whole animal basis. We've got a resting horse. A resting horse is not doing anything. 0 strides per minute, but there's still metabolic activity going on that we can quantify. The horse has got a heart rate of about 40 beats per minute and an oxygen consumption of maybe 4 to 5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute. If we look at the individual systems, the respiratory system is not working terribly hard. The cardiovascular system's not working very hard. The muscle's not working very hard. I point this out because this is what makes diagnosing poor performance so challenging for a veterinarian. most of these systems are working at a small fraction of their total capacity. So they're not looking like they're working very hard at all at rest, but at rest is where we wind up doing our initial exams. The respiratory rate is maybe only 5 to 10% of the maximum. The work of breathing is very low. Cardiovascular, we still have plenty of cardiac output to go around. So the heart's really not having to work that hard at all. The muscle is primarily using aerobic metabolism. It can afford to use the slowest way of making ATP, mostly oxidative fibers and mostly burning fat with a little bit of glucose thrown in to keep all the reactions going. And in fact, it's not even using the glucose that is in the muscle. Most of the glucose that it is burning is actually coming from the liver. It would seem like rest is not that important, but it really is, because despite the fact that we're all interested in exercise, we're all interested in getting a horse fit. And while rest is definitely not exercise, the secret here is that nearly everything that causes a horse to increase fitness actually happens at rest. The exercise is just the stimulus, but then there's the response. If a horse needs more more actin and myosin in order to have more power, those are proteins, and those proteins need to be synthesized with energy. The average protein in a cell is some 400 to 500 amino acids. Each one of those needed an ATP in order to be joined together. If you're looking for more aerobic capacity, there are dozens and dozens of enzymes that need to be synthesized in order to give the horse more aerobic capacity. Each one of those is a protein that needs to be synthesized and causes a demand for ATP. During exercise, in order to make exercise most efficient, one of the very first things that the muscle cell will do is turn off protein synthesis, stop diverting that precious ATP to protein synthesis, and instead dump all of the ATP to fueling contraction and then relaxation. And with protein synthesis blocked, the horse can exercise just fine. It can't respond to that exercise to increase its conditioning, increase its overall exercise capacity. It has to wait until it's back to resting metabolism, all of the energy stores have caught up, and then it will turn protein synthesis back on and start responding to that original exercise stimulus. We're going to talk more about this in the second webinar, because failing to give a horse enough rest after a conditioning stimulus in order to allow the horse to respond is probably one of the most common mistakes in conditioning a horse. So now we're going to move to a trot. Walking and trotting metabolically are very, very similar. So we'll just talk about a trot. And, we've all seen a trot. This is one of my horses on the treadmill, just trotting along. We're running at a little bit more than a stride per minute, which means that we've gone from contraction cycles being measured in fractions of a minute to contraction cycles being measured in fractions of a second. If he was trotting at 60 strides per minute, he would have a half a second to contract the muscle and a half a second to relax the muscle. So you remember all those steps that I talked about being needed for contraction and relaxation. Now we've got a much shorter period of time to get all those steps to fall into place in order to facilitate simply a trot. Our metabolic rate has gone up about 5 to 6 fold. Our heart rate has gone up to about 140 beats per minute. Looking at the different systems, well, we've increased our respiratory requirement. Ventilation has gone up 5-fold. Airways are now having to dilate with each breath. And oxygen uptake is meeting the demands So we still have normal blood gases. However, even though ventilation has gone up 5-fold, the work of breathing, the amount of energy that the horse requires in order to move that air, has gone up 75-fold. Work of breathing is starting to increase quite a bit, and this will be a recurring theme as we go along. Cardiovascular, we're up to more than half of the maximum heart rate. So cardiac output has gone up 3-fold. Most of that increase is actually just going to muscle and skin. All of the other tissues in the body are still receiving the same amount of blood flow. Nobody's going without, so everything is still pretty much okay. In the muscle, we're still primarily using the oxidative fibers, so we're still primarily using aerobic metabolism, and we're still primarily burning fatty acids and a bit of glucose, but all of that has started to go up. All of that has gone up 5-fold as well. We still have glucose coming primarily from the liver. Muscle reserves are still being preserved. It's a good time, though, to talk about where we're going to get this glucose. Glucose is needed even though fat is, even under metabolic conditions where fat is the primary fuel. You could use the glucose that's stored in the muscle, but it's got a very limited supply. Maybe there's a better option. The better option is actually getting the glucose from the liver. So once a horse starts exercising, or basically any mammal starts exercising, there are a variety of signals that turn on glucose synthesis from the liver. In the liver, you can take lactic acid and turn it back into glucose. You can take amino acids, turn them into glucose. The liver also has a lot of glycogen stored, and you can just simply break down that glycogen and release it as glucose into the bloodstream, and then the cardiovascular system takes that glucose to the muscle and allows the muscle to burn that glucose instead of the more restricted, the more limited glucose that's already stored inside the muscle as glycogen. This is a nice little strategy, because the fact of the matter is that using this system, the liver can produce enough glucose for hours and hours of trotting. There's no reason to use the limited reserves that are stored inside the muscle. But we're going to speed up. We're going to now go to a nice light little canter. So we're now going at nearly 2 strides per minute, 100 strides per minute or so. At a canter, a lot of horses are already at maximum heart rate and at maximal aerobic capacity, even though they're still well short of their maximal speed. 8 to 10 meters per second, or about 20 miles an hour, about 30 kilometers per hour, winds up being about the maximal aerobic capacity for a lot of the horses that we work with. Again, the respiratory tract is starting to become a limiting factor. Ventilation has gone up 13-fold. Work of breathing, 240-fold increase in the amount of energy being used to move air through the respiratory system. And that's despite the fact that the airways are fully dilated. A word of warning, those airways are fully dilated using skeletal muscle, and that skeletal muscle is just as capable of fatiguing as the skeletal muscle in the locomotor limbs. Oxygen uptake is starting to fail. In some horses, we're starting to see a little bit of an impairment of the ability of the lungs to take up enough oxygen, despite the fact that the ventilation has gone up 13-fold. Again, cardiovascular, we're nearing capacity. The diaphragm is starting to compete with the legs for cardiac output. Muscles, whether it's a diaphragm or the muscles of the leg, they can only exercise as much as the blood flow will supply the fuel. And now we're starting to run out of blood flow. We've shut off the blood flow to the stuff in the gut. We're no longer providing normal blood flow to the intestines, the liver, the kidneys. We're sacrificing that for a short term in order to provide more blood flow to the diaphragm and the working muscle. And the muscle, you know, we're getting close to maximum. We've already maxed out aerobic metabolism, and now we're starting to get into anaerobic metabolism. We're starting to use fibers that do not use oxygen. Instead, they just produce lactic acid. We've shifted away from fatty acids. Oxidation of fatty acids is too slow. We can't produce the ATP at the rate that we need in order to fuel 100 strides per minute. So we're using more and more glucose. But because we've started shunting blood away from the gut, we're not using liver glucose anymore. We're having to use the limited amount of glucose that's already in the muscle in order to fuel this exercise. This combination of stuff, of changes, is one of the reasons why a horse can't canter forever. A horse's ability to maintain a smooth cantering speed is measured in minutes, not hours. This is also a good time to talk about what happens with lactic acid. We've all learned, at least initially, that, you know, what happens is that glucose gets broken down into a molecule called pyruvate, and if there's not enough places for pyruvate to go, it gets converted to lactate or lactic acid and gets kicked back out of the fiber into the bloodstream. That's true for that kind of fiber. There is that other kind of fiber, what we refer to as oxidative fibers. Those fibers can actually take lactate up, convert it back to pyruvate, and burn it just like it was its own carbon chain. So the reality is that there's a great deal of interplay between these glycolytic fibers, the ones that largely produce lactate, and the oxidative fibers, the ones that can actually consume lactate and burn it to make a full component of ATP. That back and forth is termed the lactate shuttle. So when you get things going fast enough, you have glycolytic skeletal muscle producing lactate, and then the lactate can either go into oxidative skeletal muscle to be burned, or it can go back into the liver, be converted back into glucose, and then the glucose gets released to go be burned by the muscle brand new. The balance between the rate at which you produce lactate and the rate at which lactate is removed by either oxidative skeletal muscle or the liver is ultimately what determines how much lactate you find in the bloodstream. So using that principle, this is how we wind up with the lactic acid curve that a lot of you are likely familiar with. At a very slow rate of speed, the horse is primarily using oxidative fibers, not using very many glycolytic fibers. There's a little bit of lactate being produced, but there's plenty of oxidative fiber activity to pull that lactic acid out of the bloodstream, so lactic acid concentration in the bloodstream stays very low. As we get increase in speed, we start recruiting more and more muscle fibers in order to speed up the horse. The first fibers that are recruited are the oxidative fibers. So we don't have a whole lot of an increase in lactic acid production. Eventually, we run out of oxidative fibers to recruit, and any further increase of speed is going to be delivered by recruitment of those glycolytic fibers that are producing lactate. Suddenly now the lactate production is increasing faster than the lactate consumption, and we see that curve where the blood lactate starts to get steeper and steeper. It's important to note that this does not require any of the muscle to run out of oxygen. This is purely being driven by the metabolic nature of the muscle cells themselves and has nothing necessarily to do with whether or not the horse is getting enough oxygen. So from there, we move on to full speed, the kind of exercise that we all like to watch. So now we're cruising along at 12 to 14 meters per second. second, 30 miles an hour, or 50 kilometers per hour, 140 strides per minute. That means that a horse is taking more than 2 strides per minute, which means that it has a quarter of a second to contract the muscle and a quarter of a second to relax the muscle. And so all of those steps have to occur very, very quickly, and you have to have a tremendous supply of ATP to make this work. The horse is starting to get hot. The horse is starting to get a little acidotic. And the reason for that is because the respiratory system is maxed out. The respiratory system is, for a healthy, maximally exercising horse, has in fact failed. It's no longer able to take up enough oxygen to fuel things. So the horse has an arterial oxygen level comparable to if you and I were standing halfway up Mount Everest. It's not even able to exhale all of the CO2 being produced. And normally it's very, very easy to exhale all of the carbon dioxide. So the combination of all this is that you're getting more and more acidosis, progressively lower and lower pH. Could the horse breathe harder? Yeah, the horse is capable of breathing harder, but it would have to divert so much blood from the working muscle to the diaphragm to breathe harder that the horse would be forced to slow down. Cardiovascular system, again, we're talking totally maxed out. Not only have we started diverting muscle or diverting blood flow away from muscle, but we're also diverting blood flow away from the skin. We're no longer dissipating heat. The horse is being forced to store all that heat because blood flow to the skin has been diverted to the working muscle. And the muscle's maxed out. All muscle fibers fully engaged, and the conditions inside the muscle cells, very, very low pH, very, very high temperature. Talk a little bit more about that, because this is one of the new findings in exercise physiology, that we've always known that the muscle becomes very, very hot and very, very acidotic, but we didn't quite understand exactly what the implications were. We found recently that those conditions will actually not only be characteristic of a lot of anaerobic metabolism, and the horse is having to rely more and more on anaerobic metabolism, but part of the reasons it's having to rely more on anaerobic metabolism is because aerobic metabolism is in fact failing. The horse is getting less ATP out of that now. And that's because the conditions inside the cell are not favorable. Aerobic ATP synthesis has dropped to nearly half of what it is actually capable of doing at slower speeds. So the horse slows down. Hopefully the horse slows down after all the other horses slow down. Studies have shown that a horse can't maintain that maximal speed. 80 to 90% of horses in a thoroughbred race are slowing down in the last quarter of the race. They all start at the same time, but they don't all finish at the same time. And the difference between the equal start and the finishing place is going to be defined by how quickly they can produce ATP relative to everybody else in the field. And we'd all like to have a horse that beats the field like this. So with that, we will take a look at some questions and see what questions I've raised from people.
Thank you so much, Mike, for this brilliant presentation. I think it's extremely important for us to understand, how horses function so that we can best help them to provide their best performances. And certainly it's not that simple. And I think that what your presentation conveyed is that complexity of the oxygen transport chain, how the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system and the muscle need to coordinate to fuel that energy into the horse and allow it to express himself to his max. While we wait for questions, I wanted to go back to one of the things that you said about temperature and acidity, and certainly I'd be interested in having your take on, do the climatic conditions influence the way that a horse uses energy? So if you're racing in hot conditions, like in the Emirates, for instance, would that change from when you're racing in winter time in Europe? How would the horse adapt to that?
Well, you raise a good point, and the short answer is yes. I mean, the heat, you can sort of view the heat balance in the horse the same way we view the lactic acid balance. You know, the temperature of the horse at any given time is the balance between how much heat it's producing and how much heat it's dissipating, and it's harder to dissipate heat in hot climates. But it's not a linear function. So it's, as it turns out, it's not as huge of an influence at as you might originally think. The other thing is that it has almost no influence directly on shorter events. You know, with those events where the horse is working so hard that it's basically diverted all of its blood flow to the working muscle, and it's not even trying to dissipate heat anymore. So if it's not trying to dissipate heat, it really doesn't matter what the environmental conditions are. You know, those are, we're talking about the 20 to 30 to 40 second long exercise events. And, to some degree, you do still have to factor in the very practical nature of the horse didn't wake up in the starting gate that morning. The horse, went through the barn, it got tacked up, it jogged around the track and all. It was doing a lot of lower level exercise before it got put into the gate. And so it may have, in fact, heated himself up in a more thorough manner, because it, during those exercise intensities where it could have dissipated heat, it was too hot out to do so. So yeah. It is a complicated factor. The other thing that, and we'll talk more about this next month when we're talking about conditioning, is that, and I hope everybody sort of picked up on the idea that the ability to dissipate heat is a function of the horse's cardiovascular capacity. And that's basically how much water is in there. So if a horse knows that it's going to require more cardiovascular capacity to dissipate heat, it's been training in a hot environment, it will have a greater ability to maintain perfusion to the skin at increasingly faster and faster speeds before it eventually, inevitably, has to redirect that blood flow. But, if a horse is dehydrated, it doesn't have the cardiovascular output, and it shunts away from the skin a lot faster. So it's a complicated, I mean, we could do an entire webinar on nothing but thermoregulation in
we'll do that. We'll take you on that.
Next time it's going to be about that.
So basically, do you think acclimatation is important?
Absolutely. The horse's body has to know what it's in for in order to prepare for it. You don't want to surprise it, because surprises don't work well.
No. So Gabrielle, I think we have a raised hand from Poppy.
Yes, I've asked Poppy to activate her microphone. Can
you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thanks, Mike. That was a great presentation. I had a question. I was interested to hear your thoughts on, as you work through the different stages of exercise, it seemed like a very dark path to death and destruction. But by the way you presented it, I was wondering, what is the saving grace? How does this not end up in death and destruction? Which mechanisms save the horse or us from basically failure?
Well, I guess you have to you have to recognize that failure is not the same thing as death and destruction. Failure is simply slowing down. You know, and profound failure is being the first one to slow down. You don't want to be the first one. You want to be the last one to slow down. But no, I mean, every horse will eventually fatigue at just about any kind of exercise. So if you keep doing it long enough, yeah, metabolically, the horse will eventually fail. The question, you know, the presentation was basically designed to illustrate what the limiting factor is, so that next month when we talk about conditioning, we're specifically talking about, okay, these are the things that you need to specifically increase the capacity of in order to make the horse fatigue later. But you know, it is a fact that everything will eventually fatigue if you exercise long enough, but that's not the same thing as a complete collapse. What prevents, what makes the difference between fatigue and complete collapse, honestly, is the rider. I mean, it is the rider's responsibility to know where that line is and not to cross it, because again, a really good horse will continue to do what you ask it to do up until the point that it can't do it anymore. It's up to the rider to know, you know, not to ask more of the horse than is in the horse's own best interests.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. It looks like Sandra.
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
We
Yes.
do.
Super. I'm a Canadian in Vienna, Austria, actually, with my horse. The plane came, so we got on a plane, and here we are training. My question for you, because I used to be on the Canadian rowing team years ago, so I'm used to human athletes. And as you said, the equine athlete does not send us a memo or say, oh, my muscle's tired today, I can't do this today or that today. But I'm very curious as to when we do, I'm now riding dressage, not riding jumpers anymore. But when I'm doing the more lateral and collected movements, and I'm trying to figure out what sort of recovery time my horse needs, obviously we always end up with some stretchy circles, we ride out a bit and etc. But to correlate what she is requiring to help build the strength, and not, as you said, they will continue on until they just simply cannot anymore.
Right.
Do you have any recommendations on how to help with the recovery when you're doing the more collected movements?
Well, this is sort of a little bit stealing the punchline from the next webinar, but that's okay.
I can hold you next time. It's okay.
No, the key for dressage. So dressage itself, you know, as in the entire spectrum of equine athletic performance, dressage itself is obviously not that strenuous compared to all the other things that the horse can do. The difference in dressage, though, is that it is a very, very specific movement that in most cases needs to either be learned or it needs to be, you know, or that learning needs to be refined. Learning does not take place in a tired muscle. So the key is that the dressage horse needs a degree of cardiovascular and muscle fitness, but it doesn't need it in the competition ring. It needs it in the schooling ring. It needs it outside of competition in order to have a solid enough foundation to be able to learn the movements correctly. And you know, you were talking about being on the rowing team. You can think about what your form was when you were really, really tired versus what your form was when you were fresh and full of energy. Your form starts to degrade when the muscle gets tired, and now the muscle is learning bad form instead of good form. So the key for a dressage horse is to have the enough fitness to learn the movements, the correct movements in the correct manner, so that they can then do it. They're not necessarily going to get tired in competition as much as they get tired in practice. And
Right.
so you're actually training and conditioning for practice, not necessarily for competition. And that's the one really, kind of unique difference between dressage and pretty much every other discipline.
Great, thank you very much.
You bet.
But I think that's a great topic as well, dressage, because I think you mentioned it. The rider is the limiting factor sometimes, and in dressage they would tend to, I'm not saying it's all the riders, but some of the top level riders keep on repeating and repeating and repeating to make sure that they've done it correctly and the horse has understood. And that's where you go over that threshold of fatigue and where you're at a risk of having injury. And that's what we see in dressage horses. Most of the injuries are fatigue injuries, or horses that failed to progress in their conditioning is because, the riders have gone beyond.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can learn how to do it the correct way by repetition, but if you are repeating the wrong way, you develop muscle memory for the wrong way. And that's not what you want.
And I would have another question. I could keep
Okay.
on. Gabrielle, you're going to have to keep track of time because
Yeah, I am, but you can go.
Yeah, I have one small question about training race horses that jump, so steeple chasing horses, etc. I think that they're really the ultimate athletes because they have to combine speed and they have to combine the acceleration over the jumps and then the capacity to not injure themselves when they land, etc. So in terms of energy, what would you be trying to develop in these horses to get them at their best?
Well, I think you're absolutely correct. When you look at it in the context of how I presented the different types of exercise, and then you step back and look at a steeplechase, it's all of it in the same horse. Yeah. I mean, you're asking the horse to be three different athletes all at once. And yeah, that's going to be a very, very difficult thing to do. And only the most talented horses and the most talented trainers are able to be successful at that, because, like you say, there's sort of an element of it of endurance where you don't necessarily want to be moving at top, at the absolute top cardiovascular capacity, because we know that that's not sustainable. We know that when a horse is doing that, they are not dissipating heat that well. They're not dissipating, they're not, clearing lactic acid that well. And so they're starting to accumulate a defect in being able to produce ATP. And so you do that for a little while, and then suddenly you've got this 6 foot, 8 foot jump in front of you that is going to require all of the muscle fibers to come into play right now for this single explosive jump. And if you are using all of them to get up to the jump, you're not going to clear the jump. So yeah, it requires a horse to be three different athletes all at once. How do you train for that? Well, you basically have to practice all three of those, and and I think that, one of the things is recognizing how to manage a horse that is better at one than the other two. If the horse that is an exceedingly good, explosive jumper, but doesn't have a whole lot of cardiovascular foundation, is going to have to go around the course in a different way than a horse that has a lot of cardiovascular foundation, but not a great jumper. I wouldn't, I don't know what the short answer is for, being able to take a horse and make them all three athletes, other than the fact that you can't expect them to be the best at all three. That's just physiologically not possible. It's kind of like, in human decathlon, the decathletes are not the best at any individual sport. They've just got a very, very high average in all of them.
Yeah. So just going on from that, and that will be my last question, I guess. But do you think there is space for racing strategies as well? Because we can see in Europe, for instance, when we follow horses with the equimeter in different regions of the world, the training is completely different. And it's usually adapted to the strategy in racing. So in the US, it's all in, they, from the start, from the moment they spring out of the boxes, they just go full speed. Whereas in Europe and in Australia, there's a bit more of a strategy in, trying to keep the horse's energy and then accelerating when all the rest of the horses starts to slow down. Would that be something that you can do over a distance of 1,200 meters or 1,600 meters, like the usual distances of a race? Short distances?
I'm sorry, I'm getting a little note that says that my internet connection is unstable. I'm at the university. This is supposed to be the best internet connection I can get. So I missed the middle part of your question, I'm afraid.
No, I was asking if you think that on distances like 1,200 meters or 1,600 meters, which would be shorter versions of races, you would have space for strategy, like keeping the horse's energy at the onset of the race and then going full speed at the end, or do you go full speed all along?
Well, yeah, I think that the shorter the race, the less room there is for any strategy other than go. Because the fact of the matter is that you may have really, really great end of the race speed, but if everybody else has already finished when you kick in, you still finish out of the money. And then I think that's a lot of what you see the difference between United States versus Europe is that my perception is that the United States tends to favor shorter distance races, where it is just there's not as much strategy as there is in the longer distance. I had a horse for a trainer friend last week that it was his first start, and the horse the gate opened and the horse had no idea what to do next, and so it was horrific to watch because the horse spotted the field 15 lengths out of the gate. I mean, he just stood there in the gate and didn't leave when all the rest of the horses left. He's a heck of a horse, and he finished third, but it was only a 5/8 race, and so there just wasn't enough race left for him to have that sort of slow start and then fast close strategy, because there wasn't enough track left.
He needs to go to Melbourne. Try the Melbourne Cup.
He needs some remedial gate training, which they're doing this week.
Good
It
on
looks
him.
like Esther has a question.
Yes. Okay. Can you put your microphone on?
Yeah, hello, good evening. Sorry, it's Bram Roos actually instead of Esther. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
okay. My question is about like instead of first, if you want to build up muscles, you don't have to break them down. So we do a lot of it with heart rate, with actual current heart rate, like the exact heart rate on the moment.
Mhm.
But you just talked about temperature in the horse.
Mhm.
And now we have microchips with actually the temperature inside it, so we can directly we do nothing with it yet. How important is the actually temperature of the muscles of the whole horse in current with all the muscles? Yeah. How many time? Because we can cool them down, but how many time is in between it? Like you can overheat the horse instead of work if you have the actually temperature.
Well, yeah, and I think that technology is going to be a lot of fun to use. I've looked forward to it. You know, we've done some temperature-based measurements. In terms of the aerobic capacity of the muscle cell itself, it's not a straight line. So, the starting with a resting muscle temperature of 38, there's not a lot of loss of muscle aerobic function until you get above 42 C. At that point, you're basically running a risk of damaging the muscle more than actually training it. So, with the ability to actually closely monitor muscle temperature, I'd be using about 42 C as the point at which it's time to cool the horse off and start over again once the horse has been cooled off, because at that point, the signals in the muscle cell are not really generating a positive response. Honestly, the other place that I would love to put those temperature monitors is, and this will be a little bit trickier of a placement, is putting it over the jugular vein up close to the jaw, so that you're essentially using that temperature chip to measure the temperature of the horse's brain. It's not directly measuring the brain, you're measuring the temperature of the blood coming away from the brain. But that would be the other place, and particularly for an endurance horse, where I would be using that to, as much a safety margin as anything. You use that to basically tell you when you need to cool the horse down, just purely from a safety point of view.
Okay, that will be interesting. But now we just have only the microchip, like that is give the temperature. How current is that with the temperature in the muscles, you think?
Well, I mean, if it's, I guess the standard microchip placement really doesn't help, because all the microchip can do is measure the temperature of the tissue that is right up against the microchip. And when you really look at the temperatures of the different parts of the horse during exercise, you can have a 4 to 6 degree temperature difference from the muscle to the brain, and everything in between scattered throughout the horse. So the only way you can actually use that to measure temperature during exercise, when heat is moving everywhere, is to put the chip where you want to measure, in the tissue that you want to measure the temperature. And at that point, it's not really that great as an identity chip.
Yeah, and even I think that they're not allowed here in Holland to do that. So
Right.
okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Yep.
So, Michael, before we give Ashish the right to talk, we have one question from Luca. I'm not sure if you can see it in the chat.
Breathing at maximal speed when stride, and the duration of inspiration is very short. And in this case, what could be the role of upper airways obstruction if breathing is already impaired? The point of respiration, and you know, we're talking about it, in a healthy horse, the respiratory tract is typically the limiting factor for maximal exercise capacity. And a lot of that is because the work of breathing goes up so high compared to the amount of ventilation that they're actually getting. You know, by definition, at maximal exercise, they're not breathing enough. They're retaining carbon dioxide. They're failing to take up enough oxygen to keep the blood oxygen level at a normal level. So by definition, the respiratory system has failed in its one job, and that's to, you know, perform gas exchange. What can we do about that? Well, you know, for the most part, most of what we try to do is to make sure that we haven't added problems to the respiratory tract, either through, you know, lower airway inflammation, or, like you say, upper airway obstructions. Anything that goes wrong with the respiratory tract will simply make a bad situation worse for maximal exercise. Now, there is some recent work coming out, and I'm going to mention it again in January. For many years, we've always said that you can't train the respiratory tract. That's no longer a correct statement. You can, in fact, train the respiratory tract because, you know, like I said early on, a lot of the things that make the respiratory tract work are pieces of skeletal muscle, and we know that we can train skeletal muscle. So there's work on resistive breathing that's showing promise for being able to strengthen respiratory muscles and make it, you know, at least theoretically possible to improve the ultimate limiting factor, which is the ability of the horse to move air. To the best of my knowledge, the folks that are doing that work have not gotten it to the point where they've proven that it increases exercise performance. The research has not quite gotten to that point yet, but everything is pointing in that direction. And so I'm, you know, waiting with anticipation for the next report to come out. And I fully expect that at some point they are going to demonstrate that that specific type of conditioning work does improve exercise performance.
So we have one last question, I think, from Christopher. If you want to put your microphone.
Yeah, my question is pretty basic, actually. So you have mentioned about the amount of ATP reserve that is there in the muscle and how much it influences the efficiency with which the horse takes off with the exercise.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, how can the diet on the day of exercise be changed, or like how much influence does that have on the ATP reserves in the muscle?
So you're talking specifically about the ATP that is stored in the muscle?
Yeah, in general also, like on the day of the exercise.
Yeah, there's probably not any effect of diet on the ATP that is stored. There is the possibility of increasing the very short-term ATP, the creatine phosphate. In human weightlifters, creatine has been proven to improve weightlifting performance. You know, they will creatine load, and it doesn't necessarily increase the number of ATP, but it does increase the number of creatine phosphate, so that they have that one-step reaction to produce more ATP. That's for human weightlifting. It's a single, a single movement. So it is possible to improve exercise performance. The problem is that I'm not sure that we have an event in equine health or equine performance that would sort of be analogous to human weightlifting. I mean, in theory, it would help the break out of the gate. But the reality is, and it goes back to what I was talking about earlier with the fact that the horse is already exercising to some degree to even just get into the gate. And so even if you were to successfully creatine load a horse, I'm not sure that you'd necessarily see a benefit, because my suspicion is that they would burn up all of that just getting to the gate in the first place, and then you're stuck with the anaerobic metabolism to get them, the first quarter mile or so down the track.
Yeah, that makes sense. So probably like training the horse during the training itself, maybe we can like program the horse like.
Yeah, I mean, the best thing to do is to have enough muscle fibers to make that jump, particularly if the race is all about the jump. So in the United States, the quarter horse racing, where they're going 350 to 440 yards, they're accelerating the entire time. And so that's why you see those horses with the giant hindquarters full of glycolytic muscle fibers. They're just trained to activate as many muscle fibers as they possibly can all at once and go down the track in 20 seconds and call it good. If you don't have an event like that, then honestly, there are a lot of folks that will point out the fact that after you've exhausted all of the output of those very, very short duration glycolytic fibers, now you have to carry those fibers around for the rest of the race. And, they essentially become dead weight for the rest of the race if the race is, 2 to 3 minutes long.
Okay. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so I'm gonna have to put an end to this fascinating webinar. So thank you very much, Michael, for the presentation. It was very clear and interesting. I hope that everyone enjoyed it. And thank you, Emmanuel, for your time as well. So I'm gonna send the replay to everyone later this week by email. And if you have any questions about Arioneo or the webinars, feel free to reach out to me by email or by the phone, and I'd be happy to answer. So thank you everyone for joining us. And so we're gonna meet again on the 9th of January for the second webinar, which will be about how you can get the most out of each horse and the common mistakes that you shouldn't make when you're training horses.
Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you. Have
Thank
a great time and enjoy the holidays.